Hi, this is Ed Fitzpatrick. If you enjoy local politics as much as I do, be sure to join our friends at Rhode Island PBS for the show A Lively Experiment. Hosted by Jim Hummel, the weekly series features journalists, pundits, and politicians debating the stories and issues that matter most to us Rhode Islanders. Tune in to A Lively Experiment and be part of the conversation. Fridays at 7 p.m. on Rhode Island PBS and wherever you get your podcasts. From the Boston Globe, this is Rhode Island Report. I'm Ed Fitzpatrick. Welcome back to the podcast where we bring you big conversations from our very small state. What's it like to cruise around the ocean state on a bicycle? Local author Robert Isenberg recently released a collection of essays about his experiences as a bike rider both here and all over the world. He says the book, Mile Markers, is designed for everyday people who like to explore on two wheels. He's here in the studio now to tell us more. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you so much for having me.
So your new book, Mile Markers, is a collection of essays on cycling, but what kind of cycling are we talking about? I mean, is this for cyclists who aspire to be in the Tour de France? Or is it a different target audience?
Definitely not the Tour de France. I like to tell people that I'm a very average cyclist. A lot of people have they've seen the title of the book and their immediate response is like, oh, I'm not serious about cycling. And my approach to it is a very middle-aged dad approach. I have a number of bicycles and I think a lot about them and I write a lot about them. But what I do is usually like 10 miles an hour on basically a hybrid around town. And I want this book to speak to people who are sort of on that spectrum.
What do you hope people get out of this book?
This is one of my favorite questions. And honestly, I wasn't sure at first because it's a real ragball of different essays, different styles, lots of different approaches to the same theme. But one thing people are responding with that has made me very, very happy is they're saying, you know, I haven't thought about cycling in a while, or I've wanted to get into it. And it's pushed me over the edge. And I'm remembering how much I enjoy it. And if I get just a handful of people to do that, it'll be a success. For people who are already biking, I hope it adds another layer to the experience where they already know they enjoy it and they already use it regularly. And then there are just these little bits and pieces where they're like, oh, I never thought about this aspect of it.
So you might be an average biker, but you have an above average love of cycling. It comes through in the book. And so tell us how that developed.
Yeah, so I've always been into it. I've always enjoyed exploring by bike and traveling by bike, doing bike tours. And for 8 years, I didn't have a driver's license. I just let it run out because I really don't like to drive. And I was living in Pittsburgh at the time, which for a while was rated the #1 worst city in the country for cyclists. And honestly, I loved it. I loved the hills. I loved the traffic and the potholes and the rain. And it was sort of a test of will.
As you or them.
Yeah, maybe for all of us, honestly. And
didn't you try to become a bike messenger?
Yes.
Was that in Pittsburgh?
That was in Pittsburgh. Yeah.
So tell us about that experience.
It was at a time, it was in the early 2000s that was unusual. There weren't a lot of people, like Postmates didn't exist, and there was no like app that could set you up. So it was this one service that I happened to sort of fall in with as a contractor. They promised me, I think 50% of whatever the delivery was worth, which was really cool in theory. And then I got my first paycheck and I'm like, oh, these are not actually worth very much. So I only did it for less than 3 weeks at any rate. But I really...
How much was that first paycheck?
I think it's in the book, but I think it was like $80 or something.
I mean,
it was some terrible amount.
Yeah. No.
So I ended up not being able to continue with that, but it was really fun while it lasted. And it's something that if it was lucrative, I would have kept doing.
How old were you when you bought your first car?
I was 34.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You're from Vermont, right?
Yes.
And you lived in Pittsburgh for those 16 years, but it seemed like you found your forever home here in Rhode Island, in part or in large part because of the access to a great bike paths and great places to explore.
It's definitely icing on the cake.
Yeah.
There's so many reasons that I love Rhode Island and that I love living here. A lot of it is just you reach an age and you hit a place and it's just like, well, this is good. I don't want any more moving trucks. I love living here, and it is such an incredible asset. And the timing is amazing because so much more infrastructure has been developed in the past few years, especially since COVID.
Yeah. What's your favorite bike path?
Oh, my favorite one. I love them all for different reasons, but the one I love to take visitors on is the Blackstone Valley Trail.
Oh, yeah.
That goes up the river up to Woonsocket. It's about 10 miles each way, so it's 20 miles in total if you do the whole thing.
And can you keep going now? Can you keep going to Worcester?
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
I don't know if it goes to Worcester, but it kind of goes sort of northwest.
Okay.
And what I love about it is the history, because it follows the Industrial Revolution essentially. And all of the historic buildings, there's a lot of texture to it, bridges, waterfalls. It's really beautiful. And it feels like kind of a secret compared to the East Bay Bike Path, which is another wonderful go-to.
But a lot busier. Yeah.
A lot busier, yeah.
So what's one place to bike in Rhode Island that even local cyclists might not know about?
If you're talking about trails, the South County Trail is one that I think a lot of people in Providence don't know as well. It's about 7 miles long, and it goes through, from West Kingston around URI to basically Narragansett. It's really pretty. It goes through all of these nice little towns. But there's another one near Quonset that's about 3 miles long that very few people I know have ever heard of.
Huh.
It just sort of terminates at the water. It's just a neat area. It's good for a run, honestly, for a short run.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. So you write that Providence isn't Copenhagen, but that it's in the middle of a cycling renaissance. So where do you see signs of that?
I see it with the separated bike lanes. There have just been a lot of experiments that have happened, like the Hope Street lane, that a lot of people liked. It got a lot of criticism, but I was really glad that they tried it.
Yeah.
I would, of course, love to see it there and see it be permanent.
What do you make of the opposition it received, business owners in part, saying, where are people going to park?
Well, I don't have a business there.
Yeah.
And I tend to be Switzerland about this kind of thing. Yeah. When it comes down to it, I want to see cities become more bike friendly.
Yeah.
And if it works for the people in the neighborhood, that makes me really happy. If there has to be further discussion, then that's just what has to happen.
Sure.
But every time I see one pop up, I get excited. And I get really excited when I see people use them.
I got to ask, what's your take on the South Water Street bike lane dispute? Because Mayor Smiley had proposed getting rid of it, and he got a lot of blowback about that. And now I guess the latest is the South Water Street bike lane will remain in place until construction on its replacement starting in spring 2025. But what did you make of that whole dispute?
Well, I ride it all the time.
Yeah.
And it is very useful to me. It's a pleasure to be able to bike down it. And I like that it slows down traffic. I know a lot of people hate to hear that, but when those were 2 lanes, my understanding is that it was a lot faster. But it's hard to look at a street and say it's better this way or that way. You really have to look at the data. And I'm not an expert in the data. So it's hard for me to have an informed opinion about it, but it's something that I love to see there.
So what do you make of the new Henderson Bridge, the Red Bridge bike path? They've got that paved now, and I wanted to get your take on that.
I think it's beautiful. It's just a masterpiece. When you're on the bridge, it's evolving, but the way it's flowing into the east side, I really love. I love how wide it is. And the view is really pretty. It's got so much going for it.
How about when you get off the bridge?
When you get off the bridge, right now, I don't know what the final plan is supposed to look like.
Yeah.
Construction is never fast anywhere, and
still a lot of orange barrels.
Yeah. Rhode Island and bridges these days. But when you get off, you end up on a roundabout, on a rotary. My understanding is it's going to veer right as you get off of it, going toward East Providence. And that it's going to go along the river, sort of toward the Bascule Bridge.
Connect to the East Bay Bike Path eventually?
That I don't know. From what I've seen, it's going to look really good. Just right now, the rotary is a bit messy.
What can Providence do to make the city more friendly to bicyclists?
I think a lot of it is a cultural shift, and it's one that I see happening. I really love that there are rideshare programs. You know, it started with Jump Bike, which did not do very well.
We were too tough for threw him in the river.
But now we have spin bikes and velo, I think. I love that they're there because the people I see riding them tend to be people who look like they might not have their own bicycle. This is a way for them to get around very functionally, and it's a way for them to enjoy the city and to really explore it. Every time I see people on them, it excites me because it's a sign of the culture changing.
And you mentioned in the book the Providence Bike Jam. I remember once walking across the pedestrian bridge one night and ending up in the middle of a bike jam dance party. And it was so much fun. So tell people who don't know about Bike Jam.
The Bike Jam is great. It's a community event. It's free. I believe it's once a month, usually on a Friday evening. It's just a group of people who get together, usually in Down City, and it's a different route each time. People just ride together through the streets, very easy pace. It has a very festive atmosphere, so it stops pretty frequently to have these party stops, usually in a public space. Everyone gets to socialize, and then at the end, you feel great, and a lot of people kind of do the after-party thing.
We'll have more with Robert Isenberg after a quick break. When you want to go beyond the headlines, let me recommend Rhode Island PBS Weekly. Rhode Island PBS Weekly is an award-winning news magazine broadcast that gives you the full story, powered by investigative journalism and narrative storytelling. New episodes of Rhode Island PBS Weekly drop Sundays at 7:30 p.m. on Rhode Island PBS. Watch past episodes at ripbs.org/weekly. That's ripbs.org/weekly. I was also interested in your experiment with earless tires. I can't picture that really. Tell us about that.
You know, they look just like regular tires when they're on the wheel.
Yeah.
They were such a fun experiment, and I really enjoyed it. And then after a while, I was like, these are too slow. I knew they would be an acquired taste, and I just never ended up acquiring it.
I was also intrigued about your experience of going to Athenaeum and reading a book called Around the World on a Bicycle. Who wrote that and when?
Thomas Stevens was from Britain originally, and he ended up in California, and he ended up being the first person to ride a bicycle around the world. What was weird about this trip in the early 1880s was that he was riding a penny farthing, which is that bicycle with the giant front wheel and the very small rear wheel, because that's all that existed.
I always see one of those at the Union Station offices of the Rhode Island Foundation, right? There's one right in the lobby there,
I have never seen that, and I'm going to beeline there as soon as I can because I've always wanted to see one in person. But
the penny farthing. So he wrote a penny farthing around the world?
That's what one of the essays is sort of is about the weirdness of saying that you've ridden around the world. Since obviously you have to cross oceans and it's a very imprecise thing to tell someone, but he got as close as I think anyone could.
Wow.
And he was a really interesting character. It turns out that this book, which was a bestseller when it came out in the Victorian period, and is very hard to find these days. There's, I believe, an original edition at the Athenaeum in Providence. And I was able to look at it, and it's just a beautiful book. It has a lot of gorgeous old-school illustrations.
And I like how you described reading it. Someone watched you, and they didn't want the pages to crumble or anything.
And I used the special gloves.
Oh, you wore gloves.
Yeah, absolutely.
To read it.
Absolutely.
Wow. But a beautiful book, it
yes.
sounds like. And also tell us the story of Catherine Kitty Knox. It sounds like you're going to have a screenplay ready before too long on that.
Boy, would I love to write that screenplay. So Kitty Knox was essentially the first female African-American cyclist that anyone knows of. She was a competitive cyclist, and she's from Boston. She somehow ended up with a safety bicycle, which was the next evolution of bicycles. It's what we think of as a bicycle today with regular-sized wheels. And she just fell in love with it, and she rode very competitively and won a number of competitions back in the late 19th century. And she's just such a striking figure. And when I was writing that essay, I was like, how do I approach this really extraordinary person? It's like there should be a movie of her. And then I'm like, oh, I'll write about that. There should be a movie, and it should, I think, look like this.
Yeah, she faced a ton of racism, it sounded like, in trying to break in there.
Absolutely. I mean, it was partially the time, and it was also how people were perceiving bicycles. It was a very fashionable thing to do. That kind of combination of class and race in the middle of the Jim Crow period. It was rough on anyone trying to break in.
And tell me about that scene you painted when she went to the club, right? The club for bicyclists. Tell us about that.
She came in and she brought her membership card. She had been grandfathered in, and they rejected her. They said, you can't go. You can't attend. She ended up leaving. And in my imagined version, all of her friends who are in the, members in the same league left with her, and they all biked away. And it was this sort of like bittersweet departure. I don't think that's what happened, though. I think she ended up leaving on her own, which is, that's the glory of Hollywood, though.
Well, I'll wait for that to come to the local theater. I know you've biked in many parts of the world. What would be the coolest ride to take if getting there wasn't a problem?
Oh, boy. There are so many good ones out there. My favorite trip that I think I've taken, the coast of Taiwan. And partly it's the context for it. There was a film that came out, I believe in 2004, called Island Etude. It's a Taiwanese film about a guy who's a musician who is also hard of hearing, and he ends up riding a bicycle around the coast of Taiwan. And it's basically a road film. It was this huge sleeper hit in Taiwan, so much so that the government ended up investing tens of millions of dollars in basically this peripheral bike route that goes around the entire island, about 600 miles. And I was so amazed by that a movie that we've never even heard of would inspire a nation to invest that much and that passionately in my favorite sport. A lot of people around the world have gone to Taiwan to do this route. It's just an amazing way to see the country.
Your book made me think of teaching my sons to ride a bike for the first time. Tell us about your son. It seems like he's caught on to your love of cycling.
Yes. Yeah. So the book is bookended, so to speak. First, the introduction is about my son riding his bike independently for the first time. So being able to balance and being able to go a distance. And my hope is that it's a bit of a tearjerker. It's always such a beautiful moment. But the last essay came later as I was trying to find a way to close it. It happened to coincide with him being a couple of years older at that point and learning to use gears. And what really struck me is that when you use gears on a bicycle, you're essentially figuring out the land, and your understanding of what a bicycle can do and how you have to adjust to your environment evolves. And you're just like, oh, now there are hills, and to go up a hill, I have to change the machine to do this. And it became a metaphor to me for basically preparing your child for life. You're going to find hills that are up and hills that are down, and you have to change yourself in order to take those on.
That's great. That's great. And I can't wait for your son to hit Bike Jam.
Yes. And you and me both.
All right. Robert Isenberg, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Ed.
Rhode Island Report is a production of the Boston Globe in collaboration with Rhode Island PBS. Today's episode was produced by Megan Hall. Audio mixing and mastering by Marissa Ewing of Hemlock Creek Productions. Our music is from APM. Be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. I'm Ed Fitzpatrick. See you next week. Looking to binge watch all your favorite PBS shows? You need Rhode Island PBS Passport. Masterpiece, Antiques Roadshow, Rhode Island PBS Weekly, and many more. Watch them all, anytime, and from any streaming device. Learn more about this member benefit at ripbs.org/passport. That's ripbs.org/passport.